All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending day 2 of the Dismantle Preservation Unconference. This is the second year of the Unconference, and essentially the event's goal is to elevate historically excluded narratives and to amplify lesser heard voices. The majority of the speakers this year are students and recent graduates and grassroots activists. So I'm really excited for you all to be joining us here today. This event is free thanks to the support of the Alpha Wood Foundation, Museum Hack, and Eileen and Norman Tyler. And while the event is free, participants and attendees are encouraged to donate to any of these following charities: Latinos and Heritage Conservation, Asian and Pacific Islanders and Historic Preservation, House of Tulip, the Decay Devils, or a Apache Passion Project, which is a specific fundraiser to install skateboards in Navajo Nation. So if you learn about any nonprofits during any of the talks throughout the week, consider donating to them and that being your price of admission to the lectures. The recording of this will be live on YouTube immediately after the fact if something tears you away from the screen. But thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to pass the mic to Michael Allen.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Michael Allen. I am a historic preservationist with about 17 years professional experience, who has recently begun working on a PhD at the University of Birmingham in England. So my practice is very deep in the United States, but now I'm thrust into an international framework, and this panel reflects that. The panel today I organized with Vladimir Putnik-Prica from the University of Belgrade, who you'll hear from later. And it sort of comes from, or generates from a project we recently received Mellon Foundation Divided City funding for, a project called Housing Blocs that seeks to bridge the Atlantic divide between dialogues on preservation of mass housing in the United States and in the nations of the former Yugoslavia. Looking across continents, across different systems of heritage, and across supposed, deep political divides. This work sort of comes from my own quest to elevate the presence and visibility of mass and public housing and preservation, something, positioned in the United States that's rather problematic or opaque. And it seems like my colleagues have made some strides that we can learn from. There's also common cause here. The remaining mass housing on both sides of the Atlantic face similar challenges: public opinions, lack of awareness of modernist architecture, threats to affordability posed by gentrification, and lack of government investment in maintenance. Mass housing is the largest form of modernist architecture built in world history, yet remains sometimes a footnote in architectural historic narratives or historic preservation causes. It's almost like you wouldn't believe this is the most prevalent form of modernism from the way the story often gets told. I'm going to kick off with my presentation, turn it over to Cheryl Johnson from the United States. Then we'll hear from our friends from across the Atlantic. My slides this morning really look at the work I'm doing with my dissertation, which is studying the future of mass housing in the United States and the role of historic preservation. I'm just going to jump in here. So, some of you may be familiar with the phrase authorized heritage discourse, which is the more common international term for the ways in which we sort of shape and constrain the subjects of our preservation work. In the United States, we call this discourse historic preservation. And I pose that this discourse is actually a productive factor that might not be news to all of you. This could sound like old hat by now, but to some people, I think this is a challenging perspective, that through the work of preserving the built environment, we're actually shaping the future of the built environment. We are deciding which places have high value, which places are physically conserved, which places end up in guidebooks and roadmaps to what people need to know. And when it comes to ordinary modernism, it's often what we see here, the picturesque suburban ranch houses. There are many mid-century modern organizations here that have t-shirts and posters and all sorts of energy devoted to this common middle-class housing. And on the flip side, then we see images like this in architectural history that stigmatize public housing and mass housing architecture as drab, as run down, as decrepit or outdated. And I think while some progress has been made to challenge this image, a lot more has to be made, that we really need to, again, return to the fact that mass housing was a much more common American experience than the suburban ranch house. So why are we overemphasizing the ranch house and not the public housing unit? Well, there's a whole nest of political and cultural and racial dynamics at play, of course. My dissertation looks at 4 different sites around the country that's challenged the notion that there is no love for mass housing, that mass housing is this problematic subject. And just to be very brief, I'm looking at the Julia Lathrop homes in Chicago, a early public housing project that has been partially preserved through affordable housing tax credits. Half the site has been demolished, the other site restored using tax credits in the National Register. So a little bit of a thorny one in a lot of ways, but an example of strong effort from preservationists to save. I'm also looking at Golden Gate Village, where residents have led an initiative to list the site in the National Register of Historic Places to fight efforts from their housing authority to demolish and replace this site, which is right on the bay in Marin County. A very beautiful setting, but this is, of course, a high demand setting where gentrification is thick, and the proposed replacement would not only demolish these buildings designed by John Carl Warnke and Aaron Green and the landscape by Lawrence Halpern, but also reduce the amount of truly public units and contribute to the depletion of Bay Area affordability. I'm looking at Co-op City in the Bronx, a very functional, beautiful project, actually the largest housing project of any kind ever built in American history. A fact that ought to be taught more often. The last buildings here actually rose after Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis was demolished in that earlier slide. So mass housing marched on. This is a project that's beloved by its residents, but not really for its architecture, for its high quality of life. And it's doing rather well. And then I'm looking at Riverside Plaza in Minneapolis, once seen as one of the worst housing projects in Minneapolis, renovated in 2010. After a successful National Register nomination. Preservationists love the modernist architecture designed by Ralph Rapson. Residents really loved their homes, and this is now a very successful rehabilitation project. Across these cases, I'm looking at the reasons why these places matter to people, and I'm trying to study the different sets of values and also the histories of why certain values, like architectural historians' perspectives, have often dominated our discussions and considerations of how or what to save when it comes to mass and public housing. That if something is designed by a Ralph Rapson or has a landscape by Lawrence Halpern, it tends to get a lot more attention on most endangered lists and from SHPOs in the National Park Service. If it's valued simply because it is a beautiful place to live, then the discussion often becomes different. When it is valued because it is a source of affordable housing, often the argument is that that is not a consideration for heritage planning or historic preservation, that we look at the physical environment, not the social dynamics. Well, I think all of these dynamics are at play, and all of these are things that preservationists need to be thinking about. One other factor here is today only 2% of Americans live in public mass housing, and that is something that puts us at odds with the rest of the world. In some industrialized nations, it's over 20%. Of course, the battle to create public housing in the first place, led by people like Catherine Bauer, was always an uphill battle, chafing against market liberalism and other trends in American society that have made public housing, be seen as something anti-American. Not to go through the history in our brief remarks this morning, but public housing and mass housing architectures are relatively recent. This is something, we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of some of the first mass housing developments in the 1930s, led by visionaries who thought that we could demonstrate ways to house people in affordable, contemporary, and safe dwellings, to demonstrate the best potential, the best uses of architectural materials, modern materials like reinforced concrete. We have a first era of public housing from the 1930s under the Wagner-Steagall Act, followed by the more heavy United States Housing Act, which paired mass housing development with slum clearance, thus engendering the ire of a lot of early preservationists who've seen mass housing as a threat to the traditional built environment, and that kind of begins this uncomfortable dance between preservationists and mass housing. The Mitchell-Lama program, which built co-op cities, another important factor, at least in New York City, where the government became involved in financing cooperatives owned by the residents. In these later eras, it started to try to reform and change public housing after its supposed failure, including the turnkey project of scattered site towers, Section 236 of government financing for private developments. Then finally, the Section 8 vouchers that are a vestige of the Nixonian New Federalism, where we try to put people in market housing. Of course, that introduces a profit motive for housing Americans. And then Hope 6, which is this project that is ongoing, where the government responded to the continued and often misleading discourse about the supposed failures of public housing architecture. After a demonstration project in the 1980s, it becomes codified in 1993, and it creates grants to local housing authorities for the improvement of their housing sites, but only if they agree to tests that are designed to fail every high-rise building. And we see a wave of mass demolitions across the country. Projects like the Scudder Homes in Newark, Cabrini Green in Chicago, many others. There are over 254 grants up to 2010 alone. Under Hope 6, the supposed ill-functioning modernist environments would be replaced with beautiful, more traditional urbanism. But in the end, really what happened is we lost public housing units. Over 43,274 totally lost. Only 57% of the replacement units were actually publicly owned and publicly managed. So it's a transfer, a reverse transfer back to the market of a public good that had been underdeveloped in the first place. So many scholars would call this a neoliberal endeavor. And these are the kinds of developments that have replaced public housing projects. And some people, really admire this new architecture. And I'm not trying to get into the aesthetic debate here. But we have rebuilt many of these sites with much lower capacity for housing through arrangements, again, that introduce market actors who now make profits off of providing this housing. And we take an architecture that is symbolic, the modernist architecture of a public commitment to the public good, and try to make these developments quiet and blend in. And I think that's an interesting sort of outcome, is these discourses that new urbanism is pushed to quiet public housing and make it blend in, seem to also mean a dampening of the spirit that it is the public responsibility to care for all people, and that housing is a basic right. Public housing, even without Hope 6, has been decreasing in the United States. We've gone from almost 2 million units in 1999 to fewer than 1 million in 2018. 14 of the 20 largest housing authorities operate less than 10,000 units each. So I'm not sure what they're talking about on Fox News and other right-wing networks. The supposed power of the American welfare state is really quite diminished in our lifetime. These figures are quite concerning. And even the units that have remained standing in many places, especially the early low-rise units, have gone through transformations that we see at right to try to add traditional architectural elements to the modernist forms. So this stigma continues. And that, of course, erodes the architectural intentions of these sites. It also tries to draw them into this policy of making these sites blend in rather than curate them and understand their harmonious architectural designs. And along the way, of course, we have all of this as federal money going through the Section 106 process, But Section 106 rarely in any of these instances has been used as a tool for community engagement or has led to a successful outcome of actually deciding to preserve buildings. It's a foregone conclusion. And, Section 106 is something we hope leads to outcomes that seem impossible, saving things from the federal bulldozer. And that's the whole intention behind the NHPA in 1966. But now preservationists have sort of been quiet on a lot of these battlegrounds. And even sites where residents have prevailed to secure National Register designations, like the Lafitte homes in New Orleans or Techwood, one of the earliest public housing projects built in the 1930s under the first wave of funding, and one of the earliest National Register listings in 1976, when the project was only 41 years old. Both ultimately were demolished, and these protections were not enough to keep these projects from being mowed down. And so in Marin City at Golden Gate Village, residents understand that their National Register designation is not the end of the story, and they're fighting a very long, hard battle against their local housing authority, hoping that the tools of historic preservation ultimately will be the ones that prevail and allow them to stay in their homes. Another just endpoint here is that even if a lot of these sites have been lost, and therefore, you might question, what is the role of historic preservation? This is now a role for architectural historians to go out and document what's been lost. Well, a lot of stock still actually remains. And most of the public housing architecture in this country is quite old. I mean, it's nearing 40-year, 50-year marks. A lot of these 1930s buildings are much older. 20% of buildings, according to HUD, have significant repair needs. 8% are severely deteriorated. I don't know, if these are actually accurate figures, they're probably undercounting these tendencies. And under the last 4 years of the Trump administration, Secretary of HUD Ben Carson launched quite a strong campaign to shut down more housing projects, leaving the buildings kind of in the lurch. So we have a huge amount of buildings that, even if you don't think it's our job to be concerned about affordability and inhabitation rights, do pose a huge material question to preservation advocates, SHPOs, and the National Park Service. Buildings like Euclid Plaza at Wright here, which is one of the 106 projects I worked on for the St. Louis Housing Authority. We identified this building as eligible in 2013. The Housing Authority is underinvesting in its maintenance. It is not listed in the National Register. Local preservationists seem to be pretty disinterested in this building, frankly. Another part of the dynamic too is we're living in a nation where our housing prices have jumped the shark during the pandemic, and we're already trending in a very difficult position for a lot of middle class and working class families. 50% of renters, almost 50%, spend 30% of their incomes or more on rental housing. And the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard estimates that only 46% of extremely low income households have adequate public housing options. And at Wright, you see more and more mass housing comes down, be it the big, stark concrete slab towers like Queen Lane in Philadelphia, or the more artistic, the more aesthetically pleasing to architectural historians designs like Shoreline Apartments in Buffalo, designed by Paul Rudolph. Both didn't stand a chance when it came down to the end. Local officials had them demolished, losing the stock, losing the architecture, creating more gaps in affordability for these cities. So to that end, I just wanted to end by previewing this little slide here. This is the project Vladan and I are working on. It's not been publicly announced yet, but soon we'll have our website up and running. Housing Blocs is a set of events, one taking place in Belgrade this fall, followed by an event in Chicago in the spring, full of presentations of research and tours of mass housing sites, culminating, we hope, in an edited volume that draws activists, scholars, and residents together on both sides. And stay tuned for more announcements there. I will stop there and turn everything over to Cheryl Johnson from Chicago, a resident of Altgeld Gardens. And I'll let her say more about herself if she wants to.
Good morning, everybody. And I'm sorry I really haven't prepared a PowerPoint presentation for today. It's been kind of hectic. I love your presentation, Mike, because I learned a little bit more than what I thought I knew. I've been a resident in Allgale Gardens. It's a public housing development on the far south side of Chicago. It was erected back in the 1944, and it was earmarked for the return of World War II veteran, African American veteran who came back from World War II and didn't have a place to live in the city of Chicago. So they built 1,998 units, and it was like an enclosed community because it had all the amenity that supported community, from grocery stores to convenience and other convenience stores that was needed. We also had a lot of social services agencies that was directly uh, in the community. And also we had a recreation facility that had an enclosed swimming pool with only two park district in the city of Chicago that had a retractable roof. And my community is, I've been through the best time of it. I've seen the bad times of it, and I'm, our organization is engaged in the revitalization of my community. Allgale Gardens in 2000, I have an organization, my mother founded an organization called People for Community Recovery. We're an environmental justice organization that intersect housing, economics, education, training, into many of the discussion, and the fact that we live on in a toxic community. We was able to intersect those issues with an overall holistic of public health problems within our community. We was built on the former landfill that took the liquid waste from making railroad cars back in the in the late 18s and early 19s. So in 2000, I think I can share uh, just a little picture of what Allgale looked like. This is Allgale Gardens here, if everyone can see it. This is the landscape. We sit on 180 something acres of land, but we're surrounded by maybe 320 acres of land, along with having 19 miles of riverway connected to our community. If you can see right here, this is our forest reserve. We're right next door. So we have tremendous open space in our community. It's a two-story complex and the bedrooms go from 1 to 5. In the past, it used to be 5 bedrooms. But we in 2000, the Chicago Housing Authority decided through their transformation plan that they wanted to demolish all of our units in Allgale. As a resident in this community, we organized and was able to save our community from being demolished in total. We decided with the authority that they could transfer people and allow people to take Section 8 if they choose to, wanted to leave the community, and rotate the current resident until redevelopment is completed. We're still in the redevelopment phases, but all the residential apartments has been rehab. We're lost 674 units as they tore down in our community, but they also replaced we got like 1,600 units and we have to include ADA units, in which they converted the 2-story into 2 apartments, 1 upstairs and 1 downstairs to accommodate the ADA community. I talk about public housing because it's so significant, because for one, everybody has a right to have a place to live. It's a human rights issue when you look at housing. And public housing is a right to have access to affordable housing, because that is those are 2 different distinct issues, that because many times a lot of people just don't know that everyone should have a right to live, a place to live where it's safe and decent. Now, I want to talk about that the HUD, the Housing, Urban and Development, they became the biggest slum landlords in our country because they allowed the Public Housing Authority to not maintain public housing as it should. It wouldn't be an issue in the city of Chicago with Cabrini Greens or Robert Taylor, and those are high towers of public housing in the city of Chicago, if they was maintained just like the projects that's along the Lakeshore Drive in the city of Chicago. But we know that a lot of embezzlement, a lot of stealing has been in public housing in the city of Chicago through corruption. And that could go way back into the early 70s when they built Marina City with Chicago Housing Authority funds, which was only earmarked for the redevelopment, but they created a condo downtown at the expense of residents and in manipulation of funds within the Chicago Housing Authority. And that continues right now today. But the perception is that we are tearing up, we are demolishing, we are destroying our community. That is not true. That's the escapes that they use, and that's the vision that they portray of people in public housing. It's basically because of poor management and poor maintenance of our community, because we don't control any of those aspects in our community. And one of the biggest mistakes that they made, they don't have accountability for making the community to be sustainable. But the rule says in the Public Housing Act of 1968 or 63, I just can't remember which one, that residents should be able to benefit financially, economically, and socially within their own community. But that never happened because they never hire residents. They hire very few residents. Let me correct that. They hire very few residents in the maintenance department of the development, but they never hire residents who to live in the community in the maintenance, the management aspect of the community. So over the years, as you've seen, as I went through this whole transformation of my community, because I never knew that it was considered a project or even public housing. I grew up in the era with this community because I moved out here. My family moved out here in 1962, and I was born in 1961. So being part of this community, I was able to enjoy all the amenities that was available to the community and all the resources that was available to the community. But as time went on, you start to see the decline in the amenities that supported the sustainability of the community. The education change. In 2009, we lost our neighborhood high school, where our youth in our community, we have to now travel by public transportation, and they have to catch 2 buses and walk 3 blocks when they can walk maybe 6 blocks in circumference to a neighborhood high school. So, and when you start looking over the years, the deterioration in the commercial strip and the lack of social services for the community, what do we all expect? We expect for the community to go down economically, visibly, and physically, because it's the disinvestment not only from what HUD and CHA supposed to provide, but it was the disinvestment in the city of Chicago in the maintaining of public housing in Chicago, because their goal was to demolish public housing and create mixed income community, which has not succeeded because they changed the bricks and mortars of these developments, but they didn't manage the human development that was connected to those lands and community. So the people still call Cabrini Green home. people still call Robert Taylor home. And they do congregate in those areas. If it's only on an annual basis or when it's significant of a death in the family, they still associated with the parcel of the land that was taken from us, for an example. But when you think about housing in the United States, when the housing market crashed in 2008, nobody's give credos or credit to the renters in public housing, in Section 8, and in the market industry that really caught the housing crisis before it really totally crashed. And we're still in that recovery mode from 2008. But public housing and renters it is the place that sustained it, the housing market in the United States. And I don't have the statistic, I'm saying this anecdotally, but I see I'm talking based on my own personal experience, because I have seen many of my friends who was homeowners lost their home because they didn't have a Section 8, because they lived in a home. And then the people who had rental homes, they was able to still to maintain their lives. And because they had this generated income that was coming in from the government. So, and when you talk about preservation, currently our organization is in a fight to save, just like we saved our community in 2010, but they are still trying to destroy historical buildings in my community. The very first school building that was ever built in our community went from kindergarten to 12th grade. And it's been sitting vacant for over nearly 40 years. But the community always had a drive to be able to acquire this building, to reimagine and to repurpose this building. But unfortunately, during the times of conversation with our Chicago Public School Board, they were saying they had no interest in selling the building, and the building was really active because it was the energy source for 3 adjacent buildings that was connected on this campus. So they couldn't dismantle the building because it gave the gas and electric was utilizing for the other 3 buildings in there. So this April, we learned that they awarded a contract for the demolition of this particular building. So they did some of the environmental remediation that was required to do before they dismantled any building. And they also did some of the structural demolition, internal structural demolition on the inside. And they also got a contractor out there that's disengaging their energy source so those other 3 buildings can operate on their own energy sources independently. But we was able to stop the actual demolition permit we haven't stopped it, let me technically say that correct. We was able to get the city of Chicago to put a hold on the structural demolition of it while we tried to come up with a visioning plan and to work with the Chicago Public School as a partner, or they can give it to our org. We'll buy the building for $1, for an example, or they could just, or we could go in partnership in the redevelopment of this building, because it's a very beautiful building that was built in 1944, and it served as one of the first school buildings in the community, because I even went to that. I've served kindergarten in that building, kindergarten, first grade. So I have a personal investment in not only into that building, but this is the only life that I know that I live in. And it's not because I'm low income, as they would say, I'm at the max as of what you would pay in public housing, but this is my community. This is where I live, and this is where I choose that I wanted to be. I I have to, and I just can't imagine not seeing this community stay here. And part of the preservation application for us to be listed as a landmark area, it includes the work and the legacy of my mother left in working in this community. My mother is known nationally and internationally as the mother of environmental justice. So she had received gold medal from Bush. She's been honored by Clinton. She trained Obama Barack when he was a community organizer in Allgale. So she has a beautiful legacy, and I would like to see that this community that she also loved be around for the next few generations or more who needs affordable housing. And public housing is affordable housing. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you. Now we will transit to the former Yugoslavia. And I'll turn things over to Jelica Jovanovic, who's an architect and doctoral student at the University of Technology in Vienna, an independent researcher. And the floor is yours.
Hello. Good afternoon from this side of the pond. I hope that my internet connection is going to be stable enough. Thank you again for having me. It's really a great honor to be here and to participate in this panel with all of you wonderful people. I'm speaking basically as a person who was a member of the team which worked on the designation process of the basically housing blocks of New Belgrade. The central zone of New Belgrade has been recently protected by the state, the Republic of Serbia. And I have been working on these blocks with the Institute of Heritage Protection of Belgrade for a few years now, and also have been collaborating on the blocks 1 and 2, which I'm going to tell you about, that are currently in the status of tentative protection. So just a brief introduction, what we are talking about. I'm going to give you the example of New Belgrade. However, we also have another estate that has been protected, which is Cerak Vinogradi. I'm not going to talk about it here. However, it is the first estate that has been protected, this estate of mass housing, post-World War II mass housing of Yugoslavia, that has been protected in Serbia and in Belgrade. And I have to say it is a great, it's a challenge, I have to say. That's what it is, because there are many, although it has been a long time overdue, there are also many questions that we need to take into consideration, and many challenges that we are facing in the future, if we hope and if we strive to preserve these estates. So this is a New Belgrade as planned in 1949. It should have been basically the capital of the new Socialist Federation of Yugoslavia. However, the plans had to change in the wake of the conflict between Stalin and Tito in 1948. And basically from that plan that I have shown you, only this building has been built, or basically the structure for it. It has been finished in 1961, just prior to the first conference of the non-aligned movement in Belgrade. However, since this building remained in its position where it stands today, and I have to say it is also protected by the law as a cultural property of Republic of Serbia, it basically became as the ground zero, or one of the focal points of every plan that came after this this conflict between, after Comintern resolution between Tito and Stalin, when the state basically had to completely reassess its road towards socialism and communism, and basically that's the time when the Yugoslav model of socialism was basically established. It also had to be somehow embodied in the architecture and urban planning, and the new Belgrade as, yes, this federation capital basically served as this real-time model and testing ground for these policies, and experimentation site for these new construction technologies to be applied. This is the plan, this is the model of the plan that has been built on the site, most of it, that is. And this is the model and the plan that was developed by the Urban Planning Institute of Belgrade, which is basically treating this empty space between the old Belgrade, historical Belgrade, and Zemun, which used to be the border town of Austro-Hungarian Empire. Some of you may know that this used to be a border between the Ottoman and Habsburg Empire for centuries. So basically this empty area was a no man's land for centuries before the construction of this city. So basically the Urban Planning Institute had this area which was treated basically as a tabula rasa, which was very convenient if we take into consideration that the modernist planning actually demands in a way a situation like this. And the way the development of this area had started is basically by approaching the old Belgrade on the right bank of Sava River from the direction of Zemun. And you can see that slowly, this is the old Zemun, and you can see slowly the new modernist structures that have been built in traditional techniques during the 50s are emerging and being kind of interwoven with the houses and the old structure of Bežanija and Zemun village that you can see remaining in this area here. And then when you take a bit of broader look, when you come from the side of Belgrade, this is what you would see. For many decades, this area was actually just an empty land, which was slowly emerging from the marshland as the sand was basically poured into this area from the river of Danube. And the level of the ground was slowly being raised for 2 or 3 meters, depending on the area. So this is basically a former marshland. You can still see the ponds that remain in this area, but you can also see block 21, the first block of the central zone, the protected zone, emerging from this vast field of sand. You can still see the Palace of Federation, and you can see the then building of the Central Committee of Communist Party of Yugoslavia. You can also see the blocks 1 and 2, the ones that I have mentioned that are currently still in the procedure of being designated. They are under tentative protection of the Institute of Heritage Protection of Belgrade. Why is this area so important for the history of architecture and urban planning of Serbia, but also this, as we call it, region today, the former Yugoslavia? It is basically an area where so many of the new construction technologies have been basically tested and have been developed for this site exclusively. Most known is this EMS Žeželj technology of prefabrication. And you can see one of the construction sites in New Belgrade. This is block number 3. What is very important in this case is that basically homemade technologies, Yugoslav technologies, were applied exclusively. Some other technologies that were imported were basically used as, let's say, some form of Camus system or other systems that have been imported either from the West or from the East, but it has been so heavily experimented with them that one can basically debate whether they are the original systems as bought per patent rights, or they are some version of Yugoslav systems. It is quite important in this case to basically see also that the mass housing that came after and the mass housing that basically we protected by these designations that I have mentioned is not the only mass housing that was happening, especially in New Belgrade. You can also see that there was temporary housing built en masse for the workers and for the employees of the factories that were nearby. You're going to see them on the map. So basically, even before all these structures that we take pride in and that we usually talk about when we talk about modernist housing, prior to that, there was this vast production of very humble structures. Some of them were built in traditional techniques, some of them were built in traditional materials. But what is important is that they were some sort of proof of concept of basically the construction industry's capability of building housing en masse and basically developing their own capacities through this construction and then improving it to build structures like this in the background. So you can see here on the map, this is the old part of Belgrade, the city center. Zemun is here, and this vast area, which is circled with this red line, is New Belgrade. You can see how big the protected zone, central zone of New Belgrade is. It is located between the Federal Assembly and the old and new train station. Then there are the blocks 1 and 2. They are still in tentative protection. We hope that soon they will become, they will be protected. But there are also other protected buildings and sites that are located, basically scattered around this area. So slowly New Belgrade is becoming this very interesting modernist landscape that has many heritage values. And I have to say, Belgrade and Serbia are, Vladan is going to talk about that a bit more, but they're definitely being very well known for their modernist architecture and the urbanism and the quality of life that it provides. So just a brief look how the area looks during the construction. You can see the orthofoto photos from the early 70s. This is the documentation of the Urban Planning Institute of Belgrade, and you can see these blocks slowly emerging from the marshland. You can also see that although, for example, this is the same structural system, this EMS Žeželj that I have mentioned, you can see that buildings built in the same system are actually quite varied, which is something that the architectural scene and the construction scene of former Yugoslavia was actually quite proud of, that they were able to basically build a variety of structures, but en masse. And you can see the way that some of the buildings in this area look today. Although these structures are still, the original structures, many of the fabric has been replaced, of course, because it's decaying, it's old, it had to be fixed. I have to say that our experience from the site is that it is very difficult to convince the institutions basically to deal with this, because it's such a vast job, and since the structures, the housing stock has been privatized during the 90s, it is actually quite a difficult situation, and something that nobody wants to deal with, to start actually working with the residents and start repairing these buildings. Although there are some very shy news articles appearing in the media that are talking about, let's say, the state of urgency, as the media is trying to now spin this situation, the state of urgency of the necessity to repair the facades and the roofs and everything related to the mass housing estates and neighborhoods. Again, one of the construction sites of this area, you can see that the block 1 is built, block 2 as well, and you can see the assembly lines of these systems that are more modern than the construction that we have today. And you often hear from the elderly architects or the civil engineers or the experts that were engaged in the construction that this present-day construction is a major step down, a major downgrade of basically the value and the abilities and capabilities of the construction industry and construction scene of Serbia. It is basically something that is considered to be more modern than whatever modern we have today. Again, one of the construction sites of this zone and the assembly line of this systems. And what is quite interesting in this particular area, and especially in this particular moment, is that basically when I was a student, for example, some 15 years ago, I would hear that in Belgrade, there are no more greenfield locations to build in, to give the permits for, etc. And it was very odd thing to hear, because you can still see the empty lots, sitting and waiting to be built, waiting to be developed. It was basically during this time, post 1990s, when Serbia was still recovering from the sanctions, from the wars, and it was a very odd thing to hear. But then slowly, all of these areas that were left in the blocks were built. Usually there were office blocks, usually there was more housing, and these new structures were usually built in the areas that remained empty for years, waiting for some funding to emerge, some funding to be redistributed in order for the necessary services to be built. For example, schools, for example, cultural centers, etc. And all of a sudden you had this wave of densification of these blocks. All of those processes were basically enabled by the planning documentation that was produced by the city institutions. And also there was this whisper, let's say, about the brownfields that should be redeveloped. In this map, you can see the blue area, which is basically the place that was left for the traffic infrastructure of Belgrade, basically, entire city to be developed. This is this is the area that is surrounding the railway of Belgrade. Then you see also the red area and this orange area. That is the area that used to be basically the industry. This used to be the industrial zone that was either built or was supposed to be built sometime in the future. And the industrial capacities of the city were planned to be in this area. And then you have this green area, which is basically the remnants of the old Bežanija village. So the family housing, small densities, small structures, and all of these structures are currently being replaced. So this is the brownfield of Belgrade. However, you can still see the old plants, for example, such as this prefabrication plant of the Rad construction company. They're still standing, and you can still see them if you walk behind these new fancy construction sites and new fancy office blocks. You can still see the workers' housing, and many of them are, you know, the barracks and the temporary housing that unfortunately remained some kind of permanent solution. And in a way, for example, the people, the workers of Rad company that live here were saved, ironically, by the bankruptcy of the company and the very complicated process of resolving this bankruptcy, which is still ongoing. However, you can also see that a lot of new development is happening, especially since the railway is being restored by the credit that has been taken from the Chinese government. You can see that the traffic infrastructure is actually being built. But you can also see that the empty spaces where the traffic infrastructure such as metro system should have been built has been sold off in this very, very questionable privatization and sales processes that had happened during the 90s or early 2000s. And these areas are being relentlessly filled in with these new structures that are growing taller and taller. You have also the structures that have been built in the place where the public administration faculties should have been built. And this is mostly commerce or housing or new office blocks. And you see also the replacement of the industry. You see, for example, the plans for the shipyard, which is not going to be a shipyard. It's going to become, again, another residential complex. But what is very interesting, and especially since Michael mentioned that in his presentation, is that this process, the residents of Belgrade are basically reacting, and especially in blocks, but also in other cities that have housing estates, such as Cerak or such as Novi Sad or whatever. The residents are basically reacting, and they're also looking into the designation process as one of their possible and very very tangible strategy to try and basically try and defend their neighborhoods from the densification process, but also to try and build the community to make it stronger and more resilient, and also as a way of maybe working towards restoring their buildings that definitely need some restoration. So it's very interesting to see them fight and to see them organize. For example, they are petitioning against illegal construction in their blocks in block 45, which is also being densified, although it's not protected. And it is interesting following this through media and seeing them slowly whispering their demands that if the historical core of Belgrade is being restored through public funding, then also the modernist buildings that Belgrade is most known for should be restored in this way, or some similar funding scheme. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to quickly turn it over to Vladna Podnik-Prica, research assistant on the Faculty of Arts at University of Belgrade. And she will close us out, and we'll try to work in some time for questions after that.
I hope so, because we're a bit out of time, so I'll be really quick. I'll try to be really quick, because the focus of my talk today will be how pop culture can contribute to a better understanding of modern architecture in general, and especially mass housing, and of course how different artists helped through this process for accepting Yugoslav post-war architecture in the region. So this beautiful friendship between architecture, visual arts, and pop culture might be one of the better ways to raise the general awareness of the significance of the mass housing legacy and postmodern architecture in general. So I would like to begin with this quote from historian Svetlana Boym, which somehow defines the recent history and the rise of pop culture in the context of nostalgia. So what was once a futuristic utopia of modern architecture and mass housing is now presumably one of the realms of nostalgia, can be considered as one of the realms of nostalgia. This nostalgia can be an asset for which can help modern architecture become part of pop culture and eventually be accepted and evaluated for what it truly is. So in the case that is very specific, the case of Yugoslav modern architecture, we have some very interesting relationship between visual arts, pop culture, and architecture. In the film industry and, well, TV shows, we see that ever since the 1960s and the film called Strange Girl from 1962, these new neighborhoods were depicted in a positivistic light as something new and optimistic, but as over time, this image slowly shifted towards a more darker tone. And especially the mass housing of New Belgrade often served as a scenery to emphasize the depression and, well, general social crisis in Serbia during the 1990s, especially in the movies Absolute, 100, and Love and Other Crimes. But what is interesting, we also have this change in perspective in the recent 2 decades or so, where, for example, the TV show The Morning Will Change Everything is, in my personal opinion, a love letter to Belgrade's architecture. So not only modernist one, but in general. So we see a more personalized attitude of, well, film industry towards architecture, especially the 20th century architecture. On the other hand, we also have music as a very significant part of pop culture, and also different attitudes towards mass housing, especially. So from some bands that were criticizing these new neighborhoods and saying, I don't want to live in Block 65, to a new generation that was born and raised in these neighborhoods and that feels strong emotional connection to them. And for example, the hip hop band FTP that is comparing Brooklyn to Block, which is basically a slang reference to one of the New Belgrade's neighborhoods, and saying, well, Brooklyn is great, but Block is the best, and I will stay there until I die. So we have something that is called in pop culture, local patriotism. So this very strong personal relationship between the community and its neighborhood. Regarding music, we don't have only architecture-inspired lyrics, but also some bands, for example, Bis Limonada or Lemonade, that is a band that is strongly referencing and playing the nostalgia card, so recreating music from the 1960s, chose, for example, the Museum of Yugoslavia built in that period as their visual identity, as their the image for their album. On the other hand, we have some bands such as REFM, which chose to film an official video in the interior of an iconic modernist building, such as the Sava Center built in the 1970s for an international conference. It was a European conference on safety and environment. And what is interesting is that this building, Sava Center, was listed this year as cultural heritage. Also, when it comes to photography, we have, from more documentary photographers in the 1950s and 60s to more experimental ones, more artistic ones that, for example, Mirko Nahmias, who also produced a series called Minimal Belgrade, and social media and global pop culture contributed their popularity since Nahmias published an article on Board Panda with the title, I Found Architecture from Star Wars in Belgrade. So when it comes to this rising popularity of post-war modern architecture and especially brutalism, this all led to many artists and graphic designers exploring their aesthetic, and this naturally led to a specific form of merchandising architecture. So artists such as Jovana Radujko, that is behind the Instagram profile Brutalism and Renaissance, is making drawings of iconic buildings. And for example, her drawings found a way to be produced as merch. And this became very popular with architectural lovers, but also people who would like to have a personalized t-shirt of their own neighborhood. For example, Block 45, Jelica mentioned it, or the famous Ganex building. And maybe one of the most famous examples is the brand called Dečko Car. Two brothers born and raised in New Belgrade, and they were probably among the first who decided to cross-reference iconic Belgrade modern buildings with pop culture. So we have one of our famous skyscrapers with King Kong and other different experiments, and it is a very popular brand among, well, not only in Serbia, but more general. And what is also interesting with their photo shootings, they always choose New Belgrade. So they also feel a very strong connection with their community and with the place they grew up in. But also we have some examples such as the Polish artists called Zupa Grafika that explore brutalist buildings worldwide. So they make different editions of these cardboard miniatures that you can make. And they also chose one of our famous buildings, the Eastern Gates of Belgrade. So this rising popularity of brutalist architecture especially led to also commercials being filmed on these locations. So we have some recent commercials from 2019 and from this year that are filmed in New Belgrade and that use these iconic images and areas for their purpose. So in the end, we come to the relationship between the common man and the architecture that surrounds him. So it is widely known that people who inhabit mass housing in former Yugoslavia are very proud to live there and are emotionally attached to their neighborhoods. So we have examples of football fans and hooligans personalizing certain parts of Belgrade, the public areas, for example, with graffiti, but there are also NGOs and similar groups of citizens that are gathered to nurture the legacy and heritage of their towns, municipalities, neighborhoods, etc. And in the end, I think this quote is probably can illustrate these emotions people have. So to translate it, I grew up here as a kid, I'll die here as an old man. 61, C is not C, it's for north. So block 61 north. So, and to conclude, even though the relationship between Yugoslav post-war architecture and pop culture has been fruitful during the past several decades, I think it reached a new level with the rise of social media. And this led to a more global recognition of its value and might even have partially contributed to the official listing of some buildings. So we can say that pop culture helped people accept, understand, and eventually love this architecture, which is the most important thing for preserving architectural heritage. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope I was quick enough so we can have maybe a small discussion. So thank you everyone for your presentations. They were very insightful. I enjoyed them very much. I answered one of the questions about the fact that this New Belgrade and basically all the public housing that was built in socialist Yugoslavia got privatized in the 90s because basically the government offered the tenants and the residents to buy off their apartments so it can become private property for, well, I think very a small price that was not realistic. So this really changed the perspective, how people feel about these buildings and neighborhoods, but mostly people decided to stay in their apartments. There was not many migrations as far as I know.
Right. Let's see, we have some questions in the Q&A. The first one is, do the panelists have recommendations for the most helpful ways the general public can help save and maintain public housing if they're not local to that community? Cheryl, I wonder if you have thought on that.
I think it's, one of the things that when we fought for Save the All Gale back in 2000, we had more outside support than we had from the community itself. So I say this, that if there's a group or a person that's advocating in that community to save their community, join in legion with that organization and or that person to supply the support that is needed. You know, it was the resources that I was able to get from the outside, such as buses to take people back and forth to these different meetings, and also pay for childcare, and also gave people a little stipend because, you know, right at that particular time, people, it was challenging economically for our community to be engaged in or taking off work or trying to go to these type of meetings just to save our units. So just find out who's an advocate in that particular community and align yourself with them and give them the support that they need. Because one of the biggest challenge with trying to organize, period, is communicating with the community. And a lot of times we are technically challenged. So, you know, distributing flyers, that's a huge cost factor, you know. And a lot of times you have to do it more than once to get people to be engaged.
Right. And I would add that beyond all of that, it's also, we're all on this panel, and these are probably members of preservation advocacy organizations. Maybe you're involved with a, you know, like Vladna and Jelica is involved with Doko Moma Serbia, the modernist organization. Maybe you're part of something like that. One thing you can also do is make sure those organizations get involved in struggles over public housing, that they take that seriously, that they commit resources, they help amplify the voices of residents. It's certainly been a challenge here in St. Louis, you know, not throwing any shade, but our local has not really been wanting to get involved in any of these fights, you know? So if you're a member, you should be asking the board and the staff, where are they?
Because you have to understand that the intimidation, the retaliation is real. Mm-hmm. Especially when you bucking against the system, the public housing authority. You know, many times when I talked about the corruption in my community, the next day I get an eviction notice. And a lot of people just don't want to go through, you know, the fear of going through those different types of repercussion as when you speak up and speak out, speak loud.
Yeah, exactly. There's another question in the Q&A. Can you speak a little bit about some of the controversial right to return regulations in these developments and how it has affected displaced residents upon project completion?
Well, basically, is that people didn't read their relocation contract. People didn't preserve their relocation contract, because that was that's the protection that people need to understand and recognize, is that you have a right to return. And it all depends on, so some of the challenge with that is that the interpretation of the language that they presented these contracts in was, and the housing authority didn't go through the process of making sure people understand what they were signing for the relocation contract. We're still, as long as we're still in redevelopment in our community, those contracts has to be honored. But a lot of people didn't realize that they have the right to return, even if they took Section 8, but Section 8 failed for them. They couldn't sustain their family. That contracts kick in and allow people to, you can return back, you have that right to return back to public housing. Not to the public, you may get lucky and get back to the neighborhood that you was in before, but as long as there public housing unit available for you, you should be able to come back. So it's just that executing, reading the relocation contract and advocating on where, you know, and it varies based on different people and stuff like that, because a lot of times people who have who violate their relocation contract happens a whole lot. And it could, unbeknownst to them, it could have been one of their children's or their siblings that committed crime. And they use that as a means to evict the whole family unit, wherever their family unit is defined. So, but there's still room to challenge that, but a lot of people, the biggest challenge I've seen with the relocation contract is one, that people don't read it. People and people don't want to go through the changes of when the contract is not working for them. They don't want to go through the due processes of being heard and getting some results as a result of their right to return.
Thank you. We have a comment about the Green New Deal for public housing, a link to it. It's a proposal from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Bernie Sanders. There's a link there. I think that is a very interesting and useful tool, but in the interest
we're a member of the Green New Deal here in Chicago. Our organization serves on the steering committee for the Chicago, and we're trying to organize the whole state of Illinois to be involved with the Green New Deal for public housing, but the Green New Deal, but not just for public housing, but the Green New Deal. We supported their Thrive campaign, and we're still working on other different campaigns for the local area in Chicago. In fact, with the building, the Green New Deal supported PCR in trying to stop the demolition of the historical school building that I talked about in my presentation.
I think the Green New Deal is an excellent prompt to fields like historic preservation. The attitude that things are separate. That this is our concern and this is somebody else's concern. The thinking behind the Green New Deal and climate advocacy is that the reality, everything is related. Mm-hmm. The future we share is all related, and to draw the lines.
If not related, it's interconnected.
Yeah, interconnected.
If I may add to that, we don't have a Green New Deal, but the inefficiency, so to say, of these buildings is one of the talking points, especially of those who are advocating for their redevelopment or refurbishment, so they are more beautiful or become something else that is not this modernism. Which is considered often to be an eyesore. And it is very interesting because there have been all over Europe estates, mass housing estates have been basically put into these envelopes of thermal insulation. Often those buildings are now look completely different. The area looks completely different because they're all in these various colors and so on. And it is very, at this moment, the struggle is to basically negotiate against that type of insulation and basically working with the historical fabric and not just, putting a layer of insulation and basically erasing all of the originality and all of the history that we're trying to preserve here. But here, as Vladimir mentioned, all these, most of the stock is privatized through the right to buy. It almost happened simultaneously to the one in Great Britain or America. And it is actually quite a challenge, this fact that the stock is now private, and how we're going to negotiate this with the owners of these property is very, very, very big question for us. But some funding announced by the government for the replacement of the windows, for thermal insulation, for more efficient heating However, we still don't know how this is going to play out and how this is going to be implemented. I honestly fear another wave of devastation. I mean, that's the challenge, how to work with this funding and to somehow navigate and preserve what is there, and also preserve the communities that are there.
I think often when I talk to you all in Serbia, I feel like you're light years ahead on some of these issues of inscription. And then I think about how this privatization really has, is very different. And that's one thing where the US, despite all the things that have happened, we still have so much public ownership, despite the erosion. And we really need to resist further erosion of our stock. And the attitude that public housing has faced all along in the US is that it's some kind of, that it violates some American ethic of, bootstrapping, pulling yourself up, that it's not the government's responsibility, and that even the public housing, to get it passed in 1949, part of the deal was to really limit who could live there to, lower middle class, working class, and poor people, which is very different than the models in other parts of the world where it's wide open, where there's no shame in living in a government housing project your whole life, as Vladina's last slide reminds us. And we also have a lot of predilection towards short-term tenancy came out of the 1950s policymakers. Another way to hook like the real estate industry and political conservatives, like, well, this is temporary, right? If you pull yourself up in the world, you get out of public housing. But as we're seeing all over the country, even in places like St. Louis, public housing often is the best option. The market is not providing anything better. And what's so wrong with the government providing housing for everyone? That's a.
Well, he provide housing for the president.
Yeah,
that's public housing.
I know. Yeah, it's like.
That's one way to put it. Yeah.
So Cheryl, you had one question for Yelica. I saw it here, and
yeah.
we have to wrap up. So just regarding the shipyard, and then we can finish.
Yeah. The problem is with this shipyard, the thing is, all the information that we get is just from these websites that are basically promoting real estate development. And although it's like officially on the agenda, this green agenda and this and many problems with the way it is implemented. And I have to say, it's just one of the talking points for basically pushing the sales of these housing. These buildings are not smart. These buildings are not green, especially if you basically remove everything and put something else that has to be maintained at a very high cost in this area, especially since it's on the other side of the flood protection. So there is a huge question mark of this just a facade of environmentalism being put forward, and basically it means nothing.
Yeah, because I was just wondering, how did you take something? I don't know if you have zoning there, and how could you
not
take
anymore?
Like a shipyard?
Not anymore. Yeah.
Oh, because the shipyard is more industrialized. So how do you reach residential standards? Like because I live not too far from an international port, so I was just concerned because there are proposals that being proposed over there for redevelopment. So, but I know that housing is not zoned in that area to have any residential housing. I was just wondering. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, we have to wrap it up. So quickly. So thank you all for listening and for all the presentations. And I think Sarah will say the final word.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for this rousing discussion and the range of perspectives on how we can consider preserving public housing and how we can engage people to connect to the housing if they've never lived there, or how we can engage residents to support them to be advocates. For the attendees who are interested in more discussions on preserving, retaining, and creating affordable housing, tomorrow night at 5 p.m. Eastern, there will be a panel discussion called Preserving Housing Autonomy. I highly recommend tuning into that. They will be discussing strategies like housing cooperatives, community land trust, and tenant organizing. And for the rest of today at 1 p.m. Eastern, there will be 2 lightning talks on LGBTQ heritage, preserving and interpreting it in the UK. At 3 o'clock, there will be a lightning talk on preserving concrete architecture, as well as a talk on decolonizing archaeology in Guam. We'll conclude the day at 5 p.m. Eastern with a lightning talk on examining Germany's difficult history and a lightning talk on the resiliency in overcoming decolonization in Jamaica. So I'm really excited for the talks today. I loved how we started out our day with mass housing, and I really appreciate everybody taking their time to tune in. So keep up the good work across the Atlantic.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.